The most painful moment of my life was watching my father lying there gasping for breath, every second a race against death. The only pillar I had left was writhing in agony from lack of heart medication, while the emergency package was blocked, right at our gate by a white SUV. HOA President Karen stood there blocking it coldly, declaring, "No HOA permit means nothing gets delivered here." She thought a mad-up regulation called stop a matter of life and death, but she had no idea that the moment she signed that decision, I had called a force that no HOA would ever want to face. Do you want to know what happens when a Karen plays power games in the wrong place? Comment below, because what comes next will leave you stunned. Music HOA office. The most painful moment of my life was watching my father lying there gasping for breath, every second a race against death. The only pillar I had left was writhing in agony from lack of heart medication while the emergency package was blocked, right at our gate by a white SUV. HOA President Karen stood there blocking it, coldly, declaring, "No HOA permit means nothing gets delivered here." She thought a mad-up regulation could stop a matter of life and death, but she had no idea that the moment she signed that decision, I had called a force that no HOA would ever want to face. Do you want to know what happens when a Karen plays power games in the wrong place? Comment below, because what comes next will leave you stunned. Let me back up and explain how we got to this moment of pure, concentrated evil disguised as bureaucratic procedure. My name is Marcus Reynolds, though most people call me Mark, and 3 months ago it took emergency family leave from my job to care for my father Rick. Dad's 68 years old, a man who spent most of his career in federal service, the kind of guy who still says yes sir and no ma'am to people half his age. He raised me to believe in doing the right thing, standing up for what's fair and never backing down from bullies. Ironically, those lessons were about to get their ultimate test, courtesy of a power-hungry HOA president who misread his memo about basic human decency. Rick's heart condition had been deteriorating for months, requiring every specific medication that needed to be delivered every few days. The stuff wasn't available at regular pharmacies, had to be specially ordered, temperature controlled, the whole 9 yards. Our HOA had never had delivery restrictions before, but Karen had recently implemented what she called enhanced security protocols, which meant she got to decide what came and went through our community gates. Most residents grumbled but complied, because honestly, who has the energy to fight an HOA president over package deliveries? That was before Karen decided to use her newfound power to play games with people's lives. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was standing there helpless watching this woman hold my father's life hostage over paperwork. See, in my day job I'm pretty good at solving riddles. I analyze situations, read people, figure out what makes them tick and how to get them to do what needs doing. But right now, I wasn't Agent Reynolds of the FBI. I was just a son watching his father die, while a suburban tyrant played power games with emergency medication. The professional part of my brain was already cataloging Karen's behavior, noting the way she seemed to take genuine pleasure in my distress, how her eyes lit up when she saw my hands shaking with rage and fear. "Ma'am, with all due respect," I said, fighting to keep my voice level. "This is emergency medication for a heart condition. My father could die without it." Karen's smile widened slightly, and for just a moment, I saw something that made my blood run cold. This wasn't bureaucratic inflexibility, or even power-drunk pettiness. This was something darker, more calculated. She was enjoying this. "Then perhaps next time your family will take HOA regulations more seriously," she replied, reaching for her window control. "I suggest you drive to the main office and fill out the proper forms. We open again at 9 a.m. tomorrow." As she rolled up her window and drove away, leaving the delivery driver and me standing there like extras in some suburban nightmare, I felt something shift inside me. The scared sun faded into the background, and the federal agent stepped forward. I helped the kid get turned around, telling him I'd figure out another way to get the medication, but my mind was already working on a different problem entirely. Karen Whitfield had just made the biggest mistake of her life. She thought she was dealing with some ordinary suburban dad who'd bend that knee to her little kingdom. She had no idea she'd just picked a fight with someone who makes a living taking down people who think they're untouchable. I drove straight to the hospital where Dad was being monitored. The medication circled through emergency protocols that cost 3 times the normal price, but got the job done. Sitting in that sterile waiting room, watching my father's heart rate stabilize on the monitors, I made a decision. Karen Whitfield wanted to play power games, fine, but she was about to learn the difference between HOA authority and the kind of power that comes with a federal badge. I spent years studying criminals, understanding what drives them, how they justify their actions, and most importantly, how they eventually destroy themselves. Every bully has a weakness, every tyrant has a breaking point, and every petty dictator has secrets they'd kill to protect. Looking at my father, frail and connected to machines, but alive thanks to medication that almost didn't make it through our community gates, I felt a cold certainty settle in me chest. Karen thought one set of rules could kill a man. Time to show her what real rules looked like, because here is the thing about people who abuse power. They always believe they're the smartest person in the room, right up until the moment they realize they've been playing checkers while someone else was playing chess. And Karen Whitfield was about to discover that she'd just challenged someone who'd been playing this game a lot longer and at a much higher level than some suburban homeowners association. The nurse came by to check Dad's vitals and he squeezed my hand with more strength than I'd felt from him in weeks. "You okay, son?" he asked, and I could see in his eyes that familiar look of concern, the same expression he'd worn when I was 8, and came home with a black eye from the neighborhood bully. "Yeah, Dad," I said, meaning it for the first time in hours. Everything's going to be just fine, because it was. Karen had thought she could use bureaucracy as a weapon. She was about to find out what happened when someone who understood weapons decided to fight back. The next morning I did what any good federal agent does when facing an unknown threat. I conducted reconnaissance. While Dad rested comfortably at home with his medication properly delivered through official channels, I spent 3 hours digging into Karen Whitfield's background. What I found was a fascinating portrait of a woman who'd made a career out of small-scale tyranny. 2 bankruptcies in the past decade, both involving failed business ventures where she'd somehow convinced other people to invest their money in her questionable judgment. A divorce 5 years ago left her with just enough alimony to maintain a lifestyle, but not enough to feel secure. And most interesting of all, a series of civil complaints filed against previous neighbors in 3 different states. Karen wasn't just power-hungry, she was a professional problem person who'd elevated making other people miserable into an art form. I was reviewing her credit report when my doorbell rang. Standing on my porch was Dr. Morrison, Dad's cardiologist, but he wasn't making a house call. "Mark," he said, glancing around nervously, "I need to talk to you about yesterday's incident. Mind if I come in?" Dr. Morrison had been treating Dad for 2 years. A quiet man in his 70s, usually stuck to medical matters and avoided drama. But as we sat in my living room, he revealed something that changed the entire game. "I retired from the FBI 15 years ago," he said quietly. "Rick and I worked together on organized crime cases back in the day. When he told me what happened with the medication, I knew Karen Whitfield wasn't just some power-crazy HOA president. I've seen this pattern there." The pieces started clicking into place. Dr. Morrison explained that Karen had been asking pointed questions about Dad's medical history, specifically about his former career and whether he had any ongoing federal connections. She'd even tried to get access to his medical records under the guise of HOA health and safety protocols. "She's fishing for something," Dr. Morrison said. "And people who fish like that usually have something to hide." He handed me a business card with just a phone number. "Call Detective Sinclair. Tell her Morrison sent you. She's been watching Karen for other reasons." That afternoon, Karen called an emergency HOA meeting. The community center was packed and I could see she'd done her homework. She'd prepared a presentation about security, threats and residents who think they're above community standards. For 30 minutes, she painted a picture of the Reynolds familiars entitled troublemakers, who refused to follow simple rules and expected special treatment. She was good. I had to admit, she knew exactly which buttons to push, how to make reasonable people feel like they were under attack from outsiders who didn't respect their way of life. But Karen made one crucial mistake. She got cocky. "Some families," she said, scanning the room until her eyes landed on me, "seem to think their connections make them special, that federal employment somehow puts them above the rules that govern the rest of us." The room went quiet. I could feel dozens of pairs of eyes turning toward me, and I realized this was the moment I'd been waiting for. Karen had just given me the perfect opening to reveal exactly who she was dealing with. I stood up slowly, letting the silence stretch until every person in that room was paying attention. "You're right, Karen," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the packed space. "Some people do think their connections make them special, but here's the thing about federal employment." I reached into my jacket and pulled out my FBI credentials, letting them catch the light as I held them up for the room to see. When you're a federal agent investigating financial crimes, you learn to recognize certain patterns. Like when someone asks unusual questions about a retiree's medical records, or when they implement new policies that seem designed to target specific families, or when they show an unhealthy interest in who has federal connections. The room erupted. Half the residents were staring at Karen with new suspicion, while the other half were looking at me like I'd just revealed I was Superman. Karen's face had gone pale, but to her credit, she maintained her composure. "I'm sure Agent Reynolds understands that HOA regulations apply to everyone equally," she said, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence. "Federal employment doesn't exempt anyone from community standards." She was trying to regain control, but I could see the calculation in her eyes. She was reassessing the situation, trying to figure out how much I knew. "You're right again," I replied, putting my credentials away. "Regulations should apply equally, which is why I'm sure you won't mind when I mention to Detective Sinclair that you've been asking Medi-Cal providers for confidential information about residents. I'm sure there's a perfectly innocent explanation." The mention of Detective Sinclair hit like a physical blow. Karen's carefully maintained mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw something that confirmed my suspicions. Fear, real, deep fear of the kind that comes from knowing someone is getting close to secrets you've buried. As the meeting broke up into confused clusters of whispering neighbors, I made my way toward the exit, but Karen intercepted near the door, and for the first time, I saw her without the theatrical confidence. "Mr. Reynolds," she said quietly, "I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot. Perhaps we could discuss this privately." Her voice had changed completely, gone from commanding to almost pleading. "I'm sure we can work something out that benefits everyone." I looked at her for a long moment, studying the woman who'd been willing to let my father die over paperwork just 4 hours earlier. "You know what, Karen? I think you're right. We should discuss this further." I handed her my business card, FBI seal, visible. "Feel free to call my office anytime. My colleagues in financial crimes are always interested in community leaders who take such a hands-on approach to neighborhood management." The color drained from her face completely. Walking to my car, I felt a familiar satisfaction settle in my chest, the same feeling I got when a complex case started coming together, when seemingly random pieces of evidence began forming a coherent picture. Karen Whitfield thought she'd been playing chess with a farmer. She'd just discovered she'd challenged a professional who'd been playing this game at the federal level for years. But there's what bothered me as I drove home. The fear in Karen's eyes wasn't the fear of someone who'd been caught being petty or power-hungry. It was the fear of someone who had much bigger secrets to protect, and people with big secrets, especially people who'd already shown they were willing to risk human lives to maintain their control, could be very dangerous when they felt cornered. I thought revealing my FBI credentials would make Karen back down. I was wrong, dead wrong. The next morning I woke up to find my driveway blocked by a news van and my phone buzzing with calls from local reporters. Overnight I'd become the lead, a story on 3 different social media platforms under the hashtag #FBI bully. Karen hadn't retreated. She'd launched a full-scale counterattack that would have impressed a Pentagon strategist. The story she'd crafted was masterful in its simplicity. According to Karen's version of events, a federal agent was using his position to intimidate and threaten ordinary citizens who were simply trying to enforce reasonable community standards. She'd somehow obtained footage from the HOA meeting, edited, to make my credential reveal look like an aggressive power play rather than a response to her accusations. The video showed me standing up, flashing my badge, and making what looked like threats about financial crimes investigation. What it didn't show was the 30 minutes of character assassination that preceded my response. At worst, scrolling through increasingly hostile comments on the neighborhood Facebook page when my doorbell rang. Standing on my porch was Mrs. Patterson, our 73-year-old neighbor, who'd lived in the community longer than anyone else. She was holding what looked like an old-fashioned tape recorder, the kind journalists used before everything went digital. "Agent Reynolds," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I think you need to hear this." She pressed play, and suddenly Karen's voice filled my living room. But this wasn't the composed HOA president from the meeting. This was someone speaking in hushed, urgent tones. "I've dealt with FBI agents before," Karen's recorded voice said. "They think they can intimidate people, but they don't understand that some of us have been preparing for this kind of confrontation for years. Rick Reynolds and his boy think they're special because of their federal connections, but they have no idea what they're up against." There was a pause. Then Karen's voice continued with a coldness that made my blood freeze. "Every family that thinks they're above community standards learns eventually. Some lessons air harder than others." Mrs. Patterson explained that she'd been secretly recording HOA meetings for months after Karen had tried to find her for having the wrong color mailbox. "I'm old, not stupid," she said with a grim smile. "I've seen bullies before, but Karen is different. She talks about federal agents like she has personal experience with them. And the way she mentioned your father by name weeks before the medication incident, that wasn't a coincidence." She handed me the recorder. "There's more on there. Karen's been planning something involving your family for longer than you think." But Karen's media strategy was working. By noon, the story had been picked up by a local television station with the headline, "Federal Agent Accused of Intimidating Suburban Community." They'd interview Wedgery residents who expressed concern about government overreach and agents who think badges give them special privileges. Karen appeared on camera looking like the perfect victim, a concerned community leader who'd simply tried to enforce reasonable regulations and found herself facing federal retaliation. She was playing the David versus Goliath angle perfectly, except she'd cast herself as David. The real gut punch came when I got a call from Miss Supervisor at the bureau, Reynolds. "Agent Johnson said," his voice tired, "I'm getting calls from congressional offices. Something about an agent threatening civilians over HOA disputes. Please tell me there's more to this story." I explained the situation, but I could hear the bureaucratic wheels turning. The FBI doesn't like negative publicity, especially stories that make agents look like they're abusing their authority. "Take some time," Johnson said. "Let this blow over, and maybe consider whether this is the hill you want to die on." That evening, as I sat in my living room listening to Dad's steady breathing from his bedroom, I realized Karen had played this round perfectly. She'd taken my revelation and weaponized it against Tim, turning my authority into evidence of abuse. The woman who'd been willing to let my father die over paperwork had somehow positioned herself as the victim of federal overreach. It was brilliant, ruthless, and infuriating. But as I listened to more of Mrs. Patterson's recordings, I began to understand that Karen's counterattack revealed something crucial. She wasn't just good at manipulation, she was experienced at it. The way she'd anticipated my moves, prepared her media response, and executed a coordinated campaign suggested someone who'd dealt with law enforcement before. Her comment about preparing for confrontations with federal agents wasn't idle boasting. It was the voice of someone who'd been expecting this fight for a long time. The next morning brought another surprise. Detective Brooks and Claire called, her voice urgent. "Agent Reynolds, we need Tommy." Karen Whitfield's real name isn't Karen Whitfield. She legally changed it 12 years ago, and you're not going to like what I found when I traced her original identity. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the picture they were forming was much darker than I'd imagined. Karen hadn't just gotten lucky with her media strategy. She'd been planning for exactly this kind of situation because she'd been in similar situations before. As I hung up the phone, I felt that familiar chill that comes when a case takes an unexpected turn toward genuine danger. Karen had won this round decisively, turning my strength into my weakness and my authority into evidence against me. But her victory had also revealed something she probably wished she'd kept hidden. She was too good at this, too prepared, too experienced in dealing with federal agents. And people don't develop those skills by accident. They develop them by necessity, usually because they've got the kind of secrets that federal agents are trained to uncover. I thought I'd been investigating a power-hungry HOA president. Turns out I'd stumbled into something much bigger, much more dangerous, and much more personal than I'd ever imagined. Karen Whitfield, or whoever she was, had just made a critical error. She'd shown me that she was a professional at this game, which meant it was time for me to start playing like one, too. Detective Brooks and Claire and I met at a diner 20 miles outside our community, the kind of place where truckers and insomniacs gather at 2 a.m. to drink coffee that could strip paint. She slid a manila folder across the cracked form table, and when I opened it, I understood why she'd insisted on meeting somewhere Karen couldn't possibly have eyes and ears. The woman we knew as Karen Whitfield had been born Rebecca Morrison, daughter of Tommy Whitfield, a mid-level organized figure who'd controlled drug distribution across 3 counties in the 1992nd. Tommy had died in federal prison 15 years ago, and Rebecca had vanished from law enforcement radar shortly after his. "Your father was the lead agent on the Whitfield case," Brooks said, watching my face carefully. "Rick Reynolds put Tommy Whitfield away for life, and Rebecca swore at the sentencing hearing that she'd make every agent involved pay for destroying her family." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't random HOA tyranny or even garden variety power abuse. This was a carefully orchestrated revenge plot 25 years in the making. Karen had found Rick Reynolds, moved into his community, and positioned herself to make his life hell while maintaining perfect plausible deniability. But before I could fully process this revelation, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Agent Reynolds, I have information about your mother. Meet me at Riverside Park basketball courts in 1 hour. Come alone, Tommy," I showed the message. To Brookend, she immediately pulled up surveillance photos on her tablet. "That's Tommy Whitfield Jr., Karen's 16-year-old son. He's been in and out of juvenile detention, but lately he's been trying to distance himself from his mother's activities." An hour later, I found myself facing a kid who looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past 10 months. Tommy was tall for his age with his mother's sharp features, but none of her calculated cruelty. His hands shook as he spoke, and he kept glancing over his shoulder like he expected his mother to materialize out of thin air. "Agent Reynolds, my mom doesn't know I'm here. If she finds out, she'll send me away again, or worse." He pulled out a beaten-up smartphone and showed me photos he'd secretly taken through his mother's home office door. Karen's walls were covered with newspaper clippings about FBI operations, photographs of agents, including my father, and what looked like a detailed timeline spanning decades. "She's been planning this for my entire life," Tommy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every time we moved, every school I went to, every friend I made, it was all part of getting close to federal agents and their families. She made me learn everything about surveillance, about manipulation, about how to make people trust you so you can hurt them later." The kid was terrified, and not just of getting caught talking to me. He was afraid of his mother, and I could see why. The photos on his phone showed a level of obsession that went far beyond normal revenge fantasies. This was the work of someone who dedicated their entire adult life to destroying the people who destroyed her father. Tommy's next revelation hit me like a physical blow. "She doesn't just hate your family because of what your dad did to Grandpa. She hates you because you got to grow up normal with a father who came home every night and taught you right from wrong. She used to tell me stories about watching other kids have normal dads while hers was locked up, and how she promised herself she'd take that away from someone else's kid someday." The personal nature of Karen's vendetta was becoming clear. This wasn't just about punishing Rick Reynolds. It was about destroying the family life she'd never been allowed to have. But Tommy Savitt's worst news for last. Agent Reynolds, my mom has been talking to some dangerous people. Members of her father's old crew who got out of prison and want to settle old scores. They call themselves the Iron Wolves now. And they've been asking a lot of questions about your routines, your father's medical appointments, your security. As if summoned by his words, 3 men emerged from the tree line around the basketball court. They moved with the casual confidence of people who'd done violence before and expected to do it again. The next few minutes played out like something from an action movie, except with far less dramatic music and much more genuine fear of getting my head caved in by a tire iron. The Iron Wolves had expected to find a soft federal agent who'd panic when confronted by real street criminals. What they got instead was someone who'd spent years training for exactly these situations. The FBI doesn't just teach you how to investigate financial crimes. They teach you how to survive when those crimes involve people who solve problems with violence. When the dust settled, 2 of the attackers were zip-tied and waiting for local police, while the third was nursing a broken wrist and reconsidering his life choices. Tommy had hidden behind a park bench during the fight, but emerged to help me call for backup. My mom is going to kill him, he said, but there was relief in his voice, along with the fear, but maybe that's better than helping her kill other people. The kid had spent his entire life being groomed as an accessory to his mother's revenge plot, and I could see the moment he decided he'd rather face her wrath than continue being part of her twisted crusade. As we've waited for Detective Sinclair and backup to arrive, Tommy dropped one final bombshell. Agent Reynolds, there's something else you need to know. My mom keeps a special safe in our basement, and sometimes late at night, I hear her down there counting money and talking to herself about the account. She's always said the money came from Grandpa's old operations. But last week, I heard her on the phone talking about HOA funds and making Sarethi books stay clean until the job is finished. The revenge plot was being funded by embezzled community money, which meant Karen was stealing from her neighbors to finance her war against my family. Driving home that night with Thami in protective custody and 3 would-be attackers in jail, I realized the situation had escalated far beyond anything I'd imagined when Karen first blocked my father's medication. This wasn't a suburban dispute anymore. This was organized crime, generational revenge, and now an attempted assault on a federal agent. Karen had just crossed a line that would bring the full weight of federal law enforcement down on her head. But I also knew that corner adults are the most dangerous, and Karen Whitfield had just learned that her carefully laid plans were falling apart, which meant she was about to become much more dangerous than she'd ever been before. Tommy's information about the basement safe led to the most disturbing discovery. Yet, with the kid safely in protective custody and a warrant secured through Detective Sinclair's connections, we were finally able to piece together the true scope of Karen's operation. But it wasn't Tommy who provided the final piece of the puzzle. It was Diana Blackwood, the HOA's quiet, nervous accountant, who'd been silently watching Karen's activities for months, documenting with the meticulous attention of someone who understood exactly what she was witnessing. Diana contacted Metro Detective Sinclair, insisting on meeting at a coffee shop 3 towns away, where she was certain Karen couldn't possibly have surveillance. When she arrived, she looked like a woman who hadn't slept in weeks. Her hands shook as she ordered coffee, and she kept glancing at the entrance like she expected armed men to burst through at any moment. Agent Reynolds, she said, sliding a USB drive across the table. I've been Karen's accountant for 2 years, and I've been documenting her crimes for the past 6 months. What's on that drive will put her away for life. But you need to understand something first. The something Diana needed me to understand was that their connection went back much further than a professional relationship. 27 years ago, Diana had been Diana Patterson, a quiet freshman at Roosevelt High School who'd made the mistake of catching the attention of Rebecca Morrison. As Karen was known then, she was a senior. I was 14, and she made my life hell for 2 years. Diana explained, her voice barrel above a whisper. She would corner me in bathrooms, steal my homework, and spread rumors that I was a snitch. When her father got arrested, she blamed me somehow, said my family must have been the ones who called the FBI. Diana had legally changed her last name after high school and spent years in therapy recovering from what amounted to systematic psychological torture. So when Karen Whitfield appeared as HOA president and immediately began asking pointed questions about Diana's background, the recognition was mutual. She hired me as an accountant specifically because she knew I'd be too terrified to report what I was seeing. She was right for a while. But when I realized she was planning to hurt your family the same way she'd hurt mine, I started keeping records. The USB drive contained 2.5 years of meticulous financial documentation, showing how Karen had systematically embezzled $2.3 million from HOA funds, community improvement budgets, and emergency reserves. But the money wasn't going to gambling or personal luxuries. It was funding a sophisticated revenge operation that included surveillance secured payments to criminal associates and what appeared to be bribes to local officials. Diana had every transaction, photographed every forged document, and recorded conversations where Karen discussed her plans in detail. The worst part, Diana said, tears streaming down her face, is that she made me help her. She would dictate the false entries, make me create the fake invoices, and every time I hesitated, she'd remind me of high schoolers. She'd describe in detail what happened to people who crossed her family, how her father's associated with problems, how easy it would be to make someone disappear and make it look like an accident. Karen had been using Diana's trauma as leverage, turning their shared history into a weapon of psychological control. But Diana's revelations went far beyond financial crimes. The recordings on the USB included conversations where Karen discussed her long-term plans with chilling casualness. She talked about your father's medical condition like it was a gift, Diana said, her voice shaking with anger and fear. She said watching him decline was almost as satisfying as planning his son's destruction, because she got to see Rick Reynolds suffer the way her father had suffered in prison. She called it poetic justice. The most damning recording was from 3 weeks ago when Karen had received a phone call that changed everything. Diana had been working late in the HOA office when she heard Karen screaming at Simeon on the phone about cleaning up loose ends and making sure the Morrison problem stays buried. When the talented Karen had noticed Diana in the outer office and made a comment that froze Diana's blood. You know, Diana, some secrets are worth killing for. Harold Mills learned that lesson the hard way. Harold Mills had been the HOA president, a retired accountant who died suddenly of an apparent heart attack 6 months earlier, according to the official report. Harold had been found dead in his home office, surrounded by HOA financial documents been reviewing. At the time, everyone assumed he'd been working late and suffered a stress-induced cardiac event, but Diana's recordings revealed a different story entirely. Karen had been gradually poisoning Harold with Doxin, a heart medication that becomes lethal in large doses, because he'd begun asking uncomfortable questions about She bragged about it, Diana said, sobbing openly now. She said Harold thought he was so smart, trying to audit books, but that he'd made the same mistake as everyone else who underestimated her. She said, watching him die was practice for what she planned to do to your father. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Karen hadn't just been planning to hurt my family through bureaucratic harassment or even criminal intimidation. She'd been planning to commit murder, and she'd already killed once to protect her operation. Diana's final revelation was the most terrifying of all. Agent Reynolds, Karen knows about Tommy talking to you. She called me this morning in a panic, demanding I bring all the financial records to her house so she could review them for discrepancies. But when I got there, she was burning documents in her backyard and making phone calls about accelerating the timeline. She's not planning to wait anymore. Whatever she's been building towards, she's going to do it soon. As Diana finished her story, my phone buzzed with an emergency alert. Dad had been rushed to the hospital after suffering what appeared to be another heart attack, but this time, the paramedics had found something troubling. His regular medication had been replaced with something that looked identical, but contained a dangerous mixture of compounds that could have killed him if he'd taken the full dose. Karen had moved from planning to active implementation. The war she'd been preparing for 25 years was finally beginning, and she just fired the first shot. Driving to the hospital with Diana's evidence secured and federal backup on the way, I realized we'd reached a point of no return. Karenwas Whitfield was no longer content to play psychological games or even rely on criminal associates to do her dirty work. She was taking direct action, and that made her infinitely more dangerous than she'd been when she was simply planning and scheming, because people who've already committed murder and are facing exposure have absolutely nothing left to lose. The drive to the hospital felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. Diana sat in the passenger seat, clutching her USB drive like a lifeline, while I pushed my car through traffic with the kind of desperate urgency that comes from knowing someone you love is fighting for their life. When we arrived, Detective Sinclair was already there, along with 2 FBI agents I didn't recognize and a man in a suit who immediately identified himself as Agent Johnson from the Bureau's Organized Crime Task Force. The sight of federal backup should have been reassuring, but grim expressions on their faces told me we were dealing with something far worse than a simple poisoning. Dr. Morrison met us in the ICU waiting room, his face pale and drawn. Your father is stable for now, he said. But Mark, this wasn't a heart attack. Someone replaced his medication with a compound designed to mimic cardiac arrest while inducing it. If the paramedics hadn't gotten here when they did, if they hadn't been specifically looking for signs of poisoning because of Detective Sinclair's warning, Rick would be dead right now. The reality hit me like a physical blow. Karen hadn't just escalated to attempted murder. She'd come within minutes of succeeding. But Dr. Morrison's next revelation changed everything I thought I knew about the situation. Mark, there's something else. That delivery driver who brought your father's medication 2 days ago. The one who seemed so conveniently available when Karen blocked the original delivery. He's FBI Agent Collins, has been undercover in this community for 8 months, watching Karen's activities as part of a federal invest into organized crime, money laundering operations. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was staggering in its complexity. Agent Johnson pulled me aside and explained what I should have realized much sooner. Agent Reynolds, your father never fully retired from federal service. He's been a consultant on organized crime cases for the past 5 years, specifically cases involving the remnants of Tommy Whitfield. When Karen moved into your community 3 years ago, Rick recognized her immediately and contacted us. Everything that's happened, from the HOA conflicts to your involvement, has been part of a long-term operation to gather evidence against a criminal network that's been dormant for over a decade. The FBI had been playing a much deeper game than anyone realized. They'd known about Karen's true identity, her plans for revenge, and her financial crimes from the beginning, but they'd needed her to make the first move to reveal the full extent of her criminal network and provide enough evidence for a RICO prosecution that would dismantle what remained of her father's organization. Your father volunteered to be the target, Johnson explained. He knew Karen would eventually make a move against him, and he was willing to risk his life to make sure she and her associates would never hurt the federal agent's family. As Johnson was explaining the federal operation, my phone rang. It was Dad, calling from his hospital bed with a strength in his voice I hadn't heard in months. Son, you need to get down here right now. There's something I have to tell you before this goes any further. When I reached his room, he was sitting up in bed, connected to monitors, but more alert than he'd been in weeks. What he told me shattered everything I thought I knew about my own life. Mark, he said, gripping my hand with surprising strength. You're not my biological son. Your real parents were David and Lisa Morrison, FBI agents who worked with me on the original Whitfield case 25 years ago. Karen didn't just kill Harold Mills 6 months ago. She murdered your parents when you were 18 months old, making their deaths look like a car accident. I adopted you and gave you my name to protect you from exactly what's happening now. The room seemed to spin around me as Dad continued. David and Lisa were getting close to uncovering the full extent of Tommy Whitfield's operation when Karen, barely 27 years old then, decided to send a message to federal agents hunting her father. She cut their brake lines while they were driving home from a surveillance operation, and they died instantly when their car went off the Riverside Bridge. You were at a babysitter's house that night, and I've spent the last 25 years making sure Karen never found out you'd survived. The emotional weight of this revelation was crushing, but there was more. Dad reached into his bedside table and pulled out a manila folder I'd never seen before. These are the Morrison files. Everything we've collected about Karen's activities over the past quarter century. She's not just a woman seeking revenge for her father's imprisonment. Mark, she's the operational head of a criminal organization he's been responsible for at least 7 murders, multiple kidnappings, and millions of dollars in money-laundering operations across 4 states. As I processed this information, alarms began sounding throughout the hospital. Through the window I could see FBI vehicles surrounding the building, their red and blue lights painting the parking lot in alternating colors. Agent Johnson's radio crackled with urgent communications about subjects attempting to breach the perimeter and shots fired in the south parking garage. Karen had discovered that her plan had failed and that federal agents were closing in, but instead of running, she decided to make a final desperate assault on the hospital to finish what she'd started. The next hour played out like something from an action movie, except with real bullets and genuine terror. Karen had brought members of the Iron Wolves along with what appeared to be professional mercenaries in a coordinated attack designed to eliminate both Dad and Muhile, creating enough chaos to escape in the confusion. But what she didn't know was that the FBI had been expecting exactly this kind of desperate move. The hospital had been turned into a trap with federal agents positioned at threat, the building and grounds. From Dad's room window, I watched Karen herself emerge from an armored vehicle in the parking lot, wearing tactical gear and carrying what looked like military weapons. But this wasn't the composed HOA president I'd been dealing with for weeks. This was Rebecca Morrison, daughter of a crime boss, trained from childhood in violence and revenge. She was screaming orders at her associates, her face twisted with a ragged that had been building for 25 years. The final confrontation happened in the hospital corridor outside Dad's room. Karen and 2 of her associates had somehow made it past the FBI perimeter, and they were moving methodically through the building, clearing rooms and eliminating witnesses. When she kicked in Dad's door, she found me waiting with me, service weapon drawn, and Dad sitting calmly in his hospital bed like he'd been expecting her all along. "Hello, Rebecca," Dad said quietly. "It's been a long time since the Whitfield trial. You've gotten sloppy in your old age. Professional criminals don't usually announce their intentions by poisoning federal agents." Karen's face went with tears. She realized that everything from the medication incident to this moment had been orchestrated by the very people she'd been trying to destroy. "Rick Reynolds," she snarled, raising her weapon. "You destroyed my family. And no, I'm going to destroy yours, starting with the Morrison boy. You've been hiding all these years." But as Chas spoke, FBI agents flooded the corridor behind her, and Karen realized she was trapped. The woman who'd spent decades planning the perfect revenge had walked directly into the perfect trap. As they cuffed Karen and led her away, she back at me with pure hatred. You have no idea what you've unleashed, Morrison. My father's organization has people everywhere, and they'll never stop hunting you. But I could see in her eyes that she knew it was over. 25 years of planning, millions of stolen dollars, multiple murders, and an army of criminal associates, all undone by the federal agents she'd underestimated from the very beginning. Dad squeezed my hand as the last of Karen's associates were led away in handcuffs. I'm sorry you had to learn about your parents this way, son, but David and Lisa Morrison would be proud of the man you've become. And now, finally, they can rest in peace. As I looked out at the Forbidicals and tactical teams securing the area, I realized that this wasn't just the end of Karen's revenge plot. It was the beginning of my understanding of who I was and what I was meant to do with that knowledge. 6 months later, I stood in the federal courthouse, watching Karen Whitfield, born Rebecca Morrison, receive 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The charges read like a crime novel: 3 counts of first-degree murder, Rhode Island co-conspiracy, money laundering, embezzlement, attempted murder of a federal agent, and leading a continuing criminal enterprise. But the most satisfying moment wasn't the sentencing, it was watching Karen's face when the prosecutor read the full list of evidence that had been collected against her organization over the past 25 years. The Morrison files, as they came to be known in federal circles, contained more than just my father's meticulous documentation of Karen's activities. They represented a quarter-century of patient, methodical investigation that had mapped out every connection, every crime, and every asset of the Whitfield organization. What had started as a simple revenge plot against Rick Reynolds had evolved into the largest organized crime takedown in the region's story. Karen's mistake wasn't just targeting a federal agent's family, it was underestimating how long federal agents are willing to wait for justice. Agent Johnson explained to me after the trial that Operation Neighborhood Watch had been in development for 8 years, ever since financial intelligence units had identified unusual money flows in suburban communities across 3 states. Karen's HOA embezzlement operation wasn't unique. It was part of a sophisticated money laundering network that used homeowners associations, small businesses, and community organizations to clean millions of dollars in criminal proceeds. My family had become the focal point, not because we were random targets, but because Rick Reynolds was the one agent who understood the full scope of what they were investigating. The most unexpected revelation came from Tommy, Karen's son, who had cooperated fully with federal investigators after his mother's arrest. Now 17 and living with a foster family under a new identity, he'd provided crucial testimony about the organization's operations and helped authorities locate assets that had been hidden for decades. During our final conversation before his relocation, Tommy told me something that put everything in perspective. "Agent Morrison," he said, using the name I'd legally reclaimed, "my mom spent my entire childhood teaching me to hate people like you and your father. But watching how you treated me, even after everything my family did to yours, infinitely understood what she was really afraid of. She wasn't afraid of being caught. She was afraid of being shown that there was a better way to live." The community of Meadowbrook Heights underwent its transformation in the aftermath of Karen's arrest. The HOA was dissolved and replaced with a resident-held council that focused on genuine community improvement rather than authoritarian control. Diana Blackwood, no longer terrorized by her childhood tormentor, had become the community's financial administrator and was working to implement transparent democratic governance systems. Missy Patterson, the elderly neighbor who'd secretly recorded Karen's threats, had become something of a local hero and was teaching other seniors about digital security and surveillance detection. But the most meaningful change was personal. Learning about David and Lisa Morrison, my biological parents, was devastating and liberating at the same time. Rick Reynolds would always be my father in every way that mattered, but understanding my Morrison heritage gave me a deeper sense of purpose. I'd spent my career as Agent Reynolds investing financial crimes. Now, as Agent Morrison, I was part of a specialized task force dedicated to protecting federal agents' families from organized crime retaliation. The day after Karen's sentencing, I visited Thor Cemetery where David and Lisa Morrison were buried. Their headstone was simple: FBI agents, parents, heroes. I placed flowers on their grave and told them about their granddaughter, Tommy's younger sister, who'd been placed in witness protection after providing evidence about her mother's crimes. I told them about Rick's full recovery on his decision to return to active consulting with the Bureau, and I told them about the letter I'd received that morning from another community, another HOA president who was using bureaucratic power to terrorize residents while hiding much larger crimes. Rick had insisted on coming with me to the cemetery, despite his doctor's recommends for continued rest. As we stood together looking at my parents' grave, he put his hand on my shoulder with the same gentle strength I remembered from childhood. "Mark," he said quietly, "David and Lisa Morrison did believe in that justice would eventually find the people who hurt innocent families. They died believing that their son would grow up to continue that fight. Today, they were proven right on both counts." The letter from the other community lay folded in my jacket pocket. Another case of HOA corruption that was probably connected to an another criminal organization. Another family being terrorized by someone who thought local authority made them untouchable. As Rick and I walked back to our car, I felt the familiar excitement of a new investigation beginning, but also something deeper. The certainty that I was exactly where I belonged, doing exactly what I was meant to do. So Rick said, as we drove home, "Are you ready for the next case, Agent Morrison?" I looked at the file folder on the passenger seat, then at the man who'd raised me to believe in justice, family, and never backing down from bullies. "Dad," I said, meaning both Rick Reynolds and the memory of David Morrison. "I've been ready my whole life." Karen Whitfield had spent 25 years planning the perfect revenge against the federal agents who destroyed her father's criminal empire. In the end, she accomplished something entirely different. If you like this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alex Stories.